warm welcome to all of you who are participating today. Our debate on the, of course, US elections that took place yesterday. I'm very happy to have the guests today with me here, which we just talked about that we usually meet like every 4 years and have this kind of discussion. And that we should probably also try to find some other ways, some other times when we can also talk about other things. But anyway, we're very honored and happy that we have two guests from our let's say partner university, so to say, which is of course Cleveland State University. So we have Professor Milena Sterio, who is a professor of international law predominantly, and we have Professor John Plechnik, who is predominantly working in public policy sphere. And of course, we will be very eager to hear what they have to say. So what on the outcomes of the elections. And of course, we have with us also Professor Matej Aubel and Professor Jernej Letničanić, who are both well-known professors at our new university. My name is Gorazd Justinek, and I will be more or less moderating this debate today. We have around 60 minutes before two of our colleagues have to move forward to the next debate, and that's why we'll try to be as swift and as short as possible and concrete as much as possible. Not to take any of your time, I would like to first point out the question, or maybe ask our two guests from the United States. So how do you see the elections? How do you see the outcomes? Did you expect the result, which is more or less now already more or less well known, what the outcomes are? Maybe first Milena, then maybe John as the second, and then our two colleagues. And in between, I will try to also write a couple of things in the chat box. So please, Milena, maybe the word first to you, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this event. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. And as you said in your introduction, it definitely would be great to organize things on other topics more frequently so that we can see each other and do this more than, just every 4 years. So thank you so much for having me. Regarding the election and the result, I would say that I am not surprised about the end result. In other words, I did foresee that Donald Trump would win. I am surprised by the margin, right? Because I think the polls had been predicting a very, very tight race. And if you look back to, for example, 2016, when Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, which was also a tight race, Donald Trump did win. But for example, Hillary Clinton won the so-called popular vote, but something around 3 million votes. In this election, not only did Donald Trump win the so-called electoral college, but he also won the popular vote. Those votes are still sort of coming in, but last I looked, he was up by about 5 million votes. So I would say, sort of my short answer is that I'm not surprised by the end result. I am surprised by the margin, because I think the margin of victory does seem to go against many of the polls that had been coming in over the last few days. Now, just to kind of amplify this and explain a little bit more, Americans do tend to focus on sort of local economic issues and pay attention to things like, for example, gas prices and food prices. And so although on the macroeconomic side, when you look at the macroeconomy, things like the GDP, jobs, job growth, unemployment rate, things are actually going really well. The average voter doesn't focus on the macro issues and instead tends to focus on the micro issues. And so I think that Donald Trump as a candidate and the Republican Party was very effective in focusing on the economy in this microwave and saying, listen, job prices, gas prices are up, food prices are up, things are bad, things were much better under Donald Trump. The other issue that I think definitely played in favor of Donald Trump as a candidate in the Republican Party is the issue of immigration, where the Republican Party was effective in painting this picture of the US as having an open border. We've never had an open border. It is not an open border, but it is a fact that the Biden administration had sort of less stringent policies than the Trump administration. And it is a fact that millions of immigrants have been either trying to come into the United States or have come into the United States over the last 4 years. Now, is that a function of the Biden administration policies, or is that just a function of global migration trends? That remains up for debate. But I do think that the Republican Party was very effective, and Donald Trump as a candidate, very effective in portraying those issues as, look, these immigrants, they're coming to take your jobs, they commit crime, it's a bad thing, we don't want an open border. And so I think on those basic issues such as the economy and immigration, those definitely played in favor of Donald Trump. And then last thing that I'll say, and I'll turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor John Plechnik. Last thing that I say is that when it comes to global issues, and I know we'll talk about that, next, I would also say that the average American voter tends to not focus on foreign policy and global issues so much. So foreign policy, global issues really did not come up very much. Yes, there's the Middle East, but I would say the Middle East, the US policy vis-a-vis the Middle East tends to be kind of the same. And if anything, I would say that the US support of Israel actually played a role against Kamala Harris, because I think that many Arab Americans who normally would have cast a vote in favor of Kamala Harris actually did not vote or voted for a third party candidate, right? And so essentially sort of gave away those votes. But globally speaking, when it comes to foreign policy issues, I would say that they play a lesser role when it comes to US elections. And so I'll stop here and turn it over to my colleague, Professor John Plechnik.
Okay,
Thank you, Professor Stereo.
please, John.
So I largely agree with Professor Stereo's analysis. This election clearly was about the economy and inflation on the one hand, and immigration and the border on the other. Those were the top two issues. And from day one, Donald Trump polled out to wazoo on them, outpolled Kamala Harris, outpolled Joe Biden, outpolled Darth Vader. I mean, the reality is he owned those two issues from day one in the campaign. And since voters ultimately decided based on those two issues, the end result is less surprising. In terms of did I see it coming, I'll humbly admit that I couldn't have predicted this outcome, even though I could have articulated arguments for why Trump could win or why Trump could lose. Over the weekend, I had the opportunity to talk to Congressman Max Miller from Ohio. And Congressman Miller worked in the last Trump administration, very close to President Trump. And I asked him point blank, how do you see Election Day going? So I think his answer is actually pretty close to what the Trump campaign would have told you. He said, I see three possible nights. Our absolute best case scenario is we take both houses of Congress and the presidency. On an average night, what we're really expecting is that we take the Senate and we take the presidency. Worst case scenario, we will take the Senate. There's no mathematical way we can't. And so I think that even the Trump campaign approached this with some uncertainty, because the polls have done a terrible job in measuring Donald Trump's support in all three cycles, 16, 20, 24. And now with the benefit of hindsight, we can say they always undermeasured him, usually by about 3 or 4 points. And if you actually added 3% to every poll, you'd have come darn close to where this election ended. And I think that in the retrospect, pollsters are going to be asking, why did they reliably underpoll Trump by 3 or 4%, not one, not two, but 3 election cycles in a row? I think that conspiracy theorists will say that pollsters try to poll the outcome they want, and that the reason Trump was underpolled is that a lot of them were actually trying to predict the outcome they wanted and hopefully create a self-fulfilling prophecy. But there are plenty of pollsters who want to say, I told you so. And no one seemed to get it right. Not the conservative, not the liberal, not the Republican, not the Democrat houses. So I think it's really a more fundamental issue than that. Ultimately, once again, it's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight, this came down to being issues in election. And this was immigration, this was inflation, the two big I's.
And if I can just jump in, just to follow up on something that John said, there's actually a US historian, an older gentleman who had accurately predicted the outcome of like all of the presidential elections going back 30, 40 years. Well, John, he was wrong on this one. This is the first time that he was wrong. He actually predicted that Kamala Harris would win, and she didn't.
But you know, the one person who did get it right, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the internet sensation known as Mu Dang. the pygmy hippo from Thailand. They actually had Mudang predict the election, kind of like Groundhog's Day, by providing two watermelon cakes, one that had Trump's name, the other Camilla's, and said, whichever one the hippo eats first wins. And so I have to give it to Mudang. The pollsters were wrong, but the hippo was right. And if you're going to predict whether or not an elephant wins, I suppose you should ask a hippo.
And the other thing that I would that's a good one, John. The other thing that I would just emphasize, and Professor Plečnik already alluded to this, we are focusing here on the results of the presidential election, but there's also the Senate and the House, and those are basically, it's really like the best case scenario for the Republican Party. Here in Ohio, where John and I are located, when it comes to the Senate, there was an important Senate race taking place between a longtime Senate Representative Sherrod Brown, who was running for his fourth term in the Senate, and a newcomer called Bernie Moreno, who had basically almost 100% identified himself as a Trumper, as a basically, I stand with President, or former President, now future President Trump. And in that race, which I think, John, you maybe have a different take, but I think that race, was very, very close. And I think on that race, I'm sort of even more shocked, that Bernie Moreno did win, because I think Sherrod Brown, even though, yes, he's a Democrat, and if you're on the GOP side, you might not like him, but he was widely perceived as very likable, as someone who sort of identifies with the working class. And so I am really surprised about the outcome of that one.
And I will say, I'm not surprised about the outcome. I'm surprised about the gap in that race. I did predict that Bernie Moreno was going to win, but I repeatedly said, I think by 1%. The fact that he pulled out such a win really demonstrates that Trump had coattails in Ohio beyond what folks expected. I mean, there's no doubt that Senator Brown is a very likable guy and the sole survivor statewide for the Democratic Party. I can tell you, such a retail politician, he sent me multiple thank you notes over the years. If I wrote an op-ed in the Columbus Dispatch, there'd be a thank you note saying, what a great op-ed, Professor Plečnik, good job. And I know that he had to have been sending thousands of those handwritten notes. He probably spent every night writing them. That's the kind of person who can survive wave elections, but even Senator Brown couldn't survive the wave we saw today. I will just point out, because we are representing Cleveland State University, that Bernie Moreno is actually the former chair of our board of trustees at CSU. So we take a little pride in seeing one of our own make it to the U.S. Senate. But the real headline is not that Bernie won. I think that was a close race, and no one would have been surprised by either candidate winning. It's by how much Bernie won.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much to both of you on the other side of the Atlantic. So now let's move the microphone to our two colleagues. So maybe Jerne, you go first, and then Matej. So how do you see, or did you expect it, or did you think that something else will happen? Please, Jerne.
Thanks a lot. It's very nice to see you all, and I echo Milena, your words that hopefully we'll reinvigorate our collaboration. Also, perhaps that we meet in person in the next months and the next years. But as far as election goes, I mean, the result is surprising, particularly as John and Milena already mentioned. The margin is really surprising, and surprising because centers of power were expecting a different result. Now they were expecting more close race. If you just look at campaign funds, which Harris campaign raised, I think it was 3-1 or 2.5-1 comparing to Trump's campaign, and all the pollsters. I was quite surprised to see that the experts, the economists were wrong, because they developed this new model of predicting the elections, and just a day before election they didn't want to predict who will win. So in that way it was surprising. The result was surprising because the centers of power, they wanted us to believe that the result will be different as it happened yesterday. But if you look at the objective facts, perhaps the result is not so surprising. Kamala Harris entered the race quite late, and she, at least in my opinion, she did not succeed to separate herself from incumbent President Biden. And that really hurt her a lot. And particularly, she was not really clear on some issues. And also, when we compare the presence of Kamala Harris and comparing to Trump, there's a quite difference. I'm not sure if any of you has followed or seen any meetings and campaign both of Trump and Harris. There's a quite a difference in energy and also likeliness. Trump, regardless of ideology, whether we agree or not with his ideology, he's a likable guy. He's a guy you could have a beer with. Whereas when one watch the Harris campaign meetings, the energy, at least in my opinion, was just not there. At least comparing to Trump campaign. So taking this into account, perhaps it was not so surprising. The results are not so surprising, and just concurring also with you, John. I think one of the issues which pollsters in US, but not only in US, but also here in Central Europe have a lot of problems with, is how to measure the voting intention of the group society, which includes white male, orderly white men, which are above 50. I think it's 2 months ago, Matej, we had here at Nova Univerza, we had a lecture by Toronto University professor Ivan Kalmar. He's an anthropology professor, and 2 years ago he published a book, White but Not Quite. And the pollsters did not, again, as you said, John, again after 2016 to 2020, they did not succeed in measuring correctly the vote. And the third issue, which I would mention, which perhaps also, the pollsters and all of us underestimated, is this language. This language which often we see perhaps from certain groups also here in Europe, but also in the States. And we have seen this, in the campaign, the last days, where the Harris campaign and also Biden used this word garbage. I think this really played against them, because it created this, aura of superiority of incumbent administration, and people voted against them, and their supporters did not turn at the polls. So all of that, perhaps on the first take results are surprising, but when you go deeper, when you look at all the indicators, they're not surprising at all.
Okay, thank you very much, Jednej. So, Matej, here you go. So,
thank you, Gorazd, and great to see you all after all this time, or the 4 years. Again, a new round of election, and Gorazd was already teasing me yesterday if I want to bet on someone. And this time around, I bet on Mr. Trump. Not that I would be his supporter. To the contrary, I disagree with him basically on everything in terms of style and content. But reading between the lines, and since I studied in New York 20 years ago, I read regularly the New York Times. Reading between the lines, analysis of the posters, when there was at least towards the end, when there was the first hunch that Donald Trump might actually win the popular vote. At that point, it was clear to me that this would be very, very different election in comparison to those in 2016, when, if you would remember, until the election eve, everybody was 80% of them were convinced that Hillary would prevail, but in the end, the result was the opposite. And with this historical hindsight, when one once goes through that experience, I thought it was almost sure that Trump would prevail. But this was from the external, my own European, Slovenian perspective. Another thing that I'd like to mention at this point, but basically subscribing to everything that's been said, is the another thing that I was surprised though, but negatively, it was quite eerie to a certain extent, that the language in this campaign pretty much mirrored what we've had in Slovenia for more than 10 years now. This is the language of exclusion, the language of calling names, the language that goes really far away from that notion of political liberalism, not liberalism in the leftist sense, but the theoretical notion of political liberalism, which has always insisted on the requirement that the language, the words, the communication in public affairs, and especially the words coming from the mouth of those who would like to lead our communities, should be pervaded by, or should stand for, tolerance, civility, and fairness. I was struck to what an extent all of that was gone. And not just on behalf of Mr. Trump, and in a way, we got accustomed to his provocative style, but also on the other side of the political spectrum. In a sense, Democrats essentially, in my estimation, fell into the same kind of vernacular. And in that sense, I think for moderate political voters, in the end, it didn't make a huge difference whether to vote for Kamala or for Donald. And that, I think, it's a cause of concern. Not to mention that also the aforementioned New York Times and also other newspapers basically very seriously started launching a thesis that they even supported by certain academics, that what we are seeing now in the US and impersonated in Trump is a new wave of fascism. And so if that thesis is actually, speaking now from the academic point of view, if that thesis is corroborated by certain scientific facts, as it were, that this means that this would mean, and of course that's not true, right? That the great majority of Americans installed fascism on the pedestal of the American politics. So you see, I'm really concerned by the kind of narrative that these elections launched, and I think it will be very hard, also judging from our Slovenian experience, to mend again the political community.
Okay, thank you very much, Matej, also for your introduction. Thank you all of you for this short, let's say, comments that you had on the expectations. And I myself can add maybe that yes, we had a bet yesterday, so, and I think that more or less all of us have thought that Mr. Trump might win, but I never would have said that it will be with such a margin as all of you have said. And nevertheless, in the second part, now that we're moving into the second part of the debate, of course, despite, yes, as Bilena mentioned, that maybe foreign policy or the relationship towards the European Union and questions like this is not really the primal thing that the typical US voter would really focus on. But despite, for us, let's say in Slovenia, this is, which is something that is very important. And here we had already one question from a participant on what would you say, or what do you think does this mean for, let's say, relations from US towards the European Union, and of course, especially towards Slovenia. I mean, we have seen already one mandate of Mr. Trump. We have seen what has that brought, but nevertheless, maybe as already Matej added, and also Jerne and John, that maybe this time the campaign was a bit different, and maybe does this mean any new, I don't know, questions that will arise between, of course, the transatlantic relationships, especially in the sense not only EU, but maybe also in regards to the NATO questions, which are always there. We at the last campaign, we didn't have the Ukraine situation, we didn't have the Palestine situation, which are now going on. Maybe one more round, and also on this, maybe foreign policy, especially European Union and Slovenia, maybe relations. Please, Milena, maybe we take the same round. Then John,
Sure.
then Jerne, then Matej, please.
Sure, thank you. So, on Slovenia, as I'm sure, all of you know, Donald Trump's wife, born Melania Knavs, right? She's Slovenian. I would like to think that Donald Trump likes Slovenia, if nothing but for that, personal and family relationship. And so I don't think that things will change in any drastic fashion for Slovenians. In other words, if you're talking about a bilateral relationship between Slovenia and the US, I think things remain largely stable. When it comes to the EU and NATO, and EU more globally speaking, I do think things are perhaps a little bit different. We do know that Donald Trump, when he was president, was definitely more isolationist than, let's say, the Biden administration or other Democratic administrations. In particular, vis-a-vis NATO, he has said multiple times how he thought NATO was sort of a bad deal for the United States, and how European nations should be contributing and paying more for NATO. And so all of that to say that, Slovenia, I don't think should be concerned, but I think Ukraine should be concerned, because Donald Trump as a candidate and as a prior president has definitely been a lot more, I want to say, like, infatuated with Vladimir Putin, but there's definitely something to that relationship. And I think Donald Trump in this election cycle, at the only debate that took place between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, said that basically the parties need to negotiate a deal. So I think his stance is really to kind of force Ukrainians into a deal with Russia. Now, what that looks like remains to be seen, but I think a reasonable prediction would be to say, Russia essentially gets the territory that it already acquired in a war. There's some negotiation over some type of a guarantee that Russia won't go for more, but essentially Ukrainians have to come and negotiate, and the US is done supporting, this endless war in Ukraine. So if I were Ukraine, I would be a lot more worried. On the Middle East and Israel and Gaza, I really don't foresee any major changes. As I indicated in my first round of comments, it was actually, I think, the Arab American population of the United States that didn't give the support to Kamala Harris, because it perceived the Biden and then a future Harris administration is very pro-Israel. The United States has been allied with Israel for since basically the start, since Israel was created as a state. And so I think on that account, I think the foreign policy would have been the same regardless.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe just a quick moderating part. We have like 5 questions in the questions and answers. One is relating to the Russia-Ukraine, one to the Gaza, which we already touched upon. Then there are 2 more a bit specific questions, maybe in the next part, just to have mentioned. Please, John, the floor is yours.
So before I jump into foreign policy, I want to agree with Matej that there's been a real shift in civility that's happened even over the last 10, 12 years in the United States. I am, in addition to being a professor, I'm also a local elected official. I've been a party officer for the Republican Party locally and in Ohio. So I've gotten a front row seat as a councilman, as a county commissioner, how campaigns have gotten incredibly nasty, and not just from the candidates themselves, but all the participants, all the stakeholders, even the voters have really lost the filter that we used to have interacting with each other. I actually think it's more fundamental than politics. I think it's societal. And we could spend days talking about the impact of social media, cancel culture, and frankly, the lack of focus and attention that we've built over the last 10, 20 years with changes in technology and the way we interact with one another. But I think you're seeing a broader societal impact in politics rather than politics changing society. And I share the same concern that it is not a good thing, but I don't think we're going to fix it with a better candidate or one party defeating the other. I think we have to look far deeper into the sources in our respective societies for why regular folks think it's okay to call their neighbor a Nazi when they disagree with them on a political issue. That's just a huge shift. But looking to foreign policy, I agree with Milena. I think that President Trump has a great affection for Slovenia, in no small part due to his wife. I'll never forget when the president met Pope Francis, and he looked at him and said, "What's Milena feeding you, Petitza?" And that was kind of an international headline that really broadcast both the Pope's connection to Slovenian culture, having come up as a cardinal and a priest in Argentina, which obviously has very strong connections to Slovenia, as well as President Trump. In terms of what he will do with Ukraine, I think you believe President Trump, you take him at his word. I have personally attended his rallies and events. I've watched the live streams of many of them. And what's kind of unique about American politicians is President Trump will give a 2, 3, 4-hour policy speech. Most folks have a very scripted presentation. They're in and out in 20 or 30 minutes. President Trump goes off the cuff for hours on end. And so whether you agree or disagree with him, you know it's sincere. He's speaking with no script. And he has said very firmly in so many of those speeches, I will resolve the Ukraine situation before I even step back in the Oval Office. As soon as I win, I will start to work on it. I agree that there will be some negotiation between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States to try to bring an end to the war, because President Trump has said, I will end it, preferably before I even walk back into the Oval Office January of next year. I don't know that's a bad thing for Ukraine. That could end up being a very positive outcome because the country is being ripped apart in war. And I do believe that Putin has great fear of President Trump. I don't think the relationship between them is one of brotherly love. I think that Putin understands that Donald Trump is a very brazen and blatant leader. And if he says, I will obliterate you, he's not bluffing, he means it. And the midlife crisis that President Putin has had of trying to be a conqueror before he either becomes too old or gets assassinated by someone, I think he realizes he's going to have to buy a Porsche rather than the Ukraine because President Trump is not going to allow it.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for touching upon also this foreign policy issues. Now, Jerne and Matej, please.
Yeah, this is a quite ambiguous issue. I mean, what will be the future U.S. administration policy in international arena? Just now, the relations, international law and relations are quite chaotic. You know, we have two major wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and there is one looming war in the South China Sea concerning Taiwan question. So there's a lot of instability and also states care for themselves. But this is an environment which Trump thrives in. So I would say that Trump will try to stabilize the current international relations, and that, of course, will mean that institutions will not play an important role in the next 4 years. So United Nations and other multilateral and bilateral agreements institutions will not play an important role, but that doesn't mean that international relations will become more unstable, because it's very hard for them to turn more unstable as they are at the moment. Concerning Ukraine question, I think the Ukraine accession to NATO is off the table. You know, it would be quite utopian to claim that Trump will support that. I don't expect the end of the war so soon. In a couple of months, I think this will go on for a year at least, and Trump here will not change the policy of Biden so much as it is expected. I do expect that in the Middle East, the things will become more calm. That perhaps Trump will tell down Netanyahu, and that perhaps the risk of all full-fledged war between Iran and Israel will be lower as they are at the moment. But concerning Slovenia, I would here have a different point as Milena and John. I think the relationship between the US and Slovenia, they are traditionally good, on paper, on a rhetoric level, but I don't expect them to improve. At least as in Slovenia, we have the government we have, the current government. We should remember that the Prime Minister of Slovenia just a couple of weeks ago visited the White House. He was lobbying for this visit to Joe Biden for many years, many months, and then he succeeded just a couple of weeks before the election. Of course, this fact will not go unnoticed, and I don't expect that Trump will, take revenge because of this visit, but I would expect that the relations will stay as they are. They will not get better as long in Slovenia there is the government as it is. And regardless whether Mr. Trump has a Slovenian, American Slovenian wife, I'm not sure if she remembers that she's still Slovenian because she almost never mentions her background. Even if you read her latest memoir, there is hardly a section or a sentence or on her Slovenian origins and a Slovenian background. So I don't think that Slovenia will play a big role in the next Trump administration. Perhaps if the winds change in Slovenia, then potentially Trump could visit in the second half of his term Ljubljana and other parts of Slovenia.
Okay, thank you, Erne. Matej, here you go.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, speculating about the implications of these elections, it's very hard. But one thing that should be mentioned, which as a matter of interest, is how much attention the U.S. election actually have in Europe. For example, at the moment, the EU administration is under construction in Brussels. The hearings are taking place. But this is completely somewhere in the, behind. It's not behind the scenes, but it's just not in the limelight, right? But why is that so? And I think, adding to that basically most of the Europeans, including the governments, other than the European patriots in those in several member states, the more naughty ones, all actually cheered for Kamala Harris. This great interest of Europe into the US and cheering for Kamala Harris was just I think the last Europe's or EU's hope to preserve the status quo. And it was so the European interest in the US election is a selfish one because we simply wanted to avoid the necessary reforms, the necessary changes that have to take place in Europe to eventually stand on our own feet. And I think one of the most important consequences of this election, if Trump and John says that we should believe what Trump has said, it's clear that we will move into the direction of economic protectionism, subsidies, tariffs, and this will put a huge financial burden on the European economy, which has been already by now extremely uncompetitive. And this lack of competitiveness will only exacerbate because the Chinese goods, if the higher tariffs are imposed on the Chinese goods in the US, these goods will be directed to Europe's doorstep, and the market will be flooded by cheap Chinese goods, which will put another pressure on the lingering European economy. And this will translate into the lower economic growth, and this will cause socioeconomic problems in Europe. So this might be a major thing, and I hope it's not just might be, it will be a major thing, but I hope it is used as a wake-up call for the European leaders, both on the supranational and national plane, to get things finally moving and not just speaking. We had 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I don't even remember anymore, this conference on the future of Europe. Some things were written on the paper, but the future is lapsing from our hands. Another thing, which is, if we are following John's proposition that we should trust what President Trump has said, we will see the replacement of multilateralism, the replacement of the liberal international order based on rules, principles, and international law with the transactional international politics. And once we are in the transactional international politics, the one who has the upper hand is the one who's more powerful. And again, that's bad from the European perspective, because Europe has always prided itself not to be powerful in hard terms, but soft terms. We've been a soft power, economic power. Deliberately, we haven't developed our own army. We have been under the American NATO umbrella. And if we have a strong person in Washington who does his own business with Putin and other states around the world, Europe will become isolated, and also if NATO's if the pledge that NATO will in a way not be anymore in America's first interest, this will impose a huge burden on the European politics, how to take care of our own defense, even if we purchased a huge debt to raise the army industry, military industry. There are simply no industrial complexes in Europe where we could build arms. So here, the demise of the Democrats in the U.S. And the rise of the Republicans and this more isolationist transactional approach, I think this will be really the wake-up call for Europe to change its course of action and really invest in its own strategic autonomy. But for that, you need democratic legitimacy, and for that, you need leaders on the national and supranational plane that have authority, legitimate authority, and those kind of leaders are currently not in sight in Europe. So I think many capitals today in Europe are really taking deep breath of what is lying ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Matej. Just let me go maybe shortly over the two questions which are there in the questions and answers. So the first question, which I think we still didn't answer, would be on how would we interpret the certain notable members of the Republican Party publicly supported the opposite candidate. And the second question is related, it's a longer one, but it's related. How would President Trump approach the debt burden of the USA, which is, of course, an issue, I would say also for the other countries, but especially for the US. Maybe I can pose one more question, which is quite interesting for me. What would, especially you two who are coming from the US, how would you explain, or what would be your call on the role of Elon Musk? So was his role like really important or not so much? Yes, and that would be, let's say, for this final round. Maybe we have like 15 minutes before we finish. So I would kind of one more round or maybe on this question. So please, Milena, John, as we had, yes.
Sure, and I'll be brief because I know we don't have that much time. I want to make sure that my colleagues also have time to speak here. So I think that the opposition from certain notable members of the Republican Party, and especially those who had held very high up positions in the prior Trump administration, including the former Vice President Mike Pence, is really not surprising. And I think it has to do, to a large extent, with Donald Trump's claims that the 2020 election was stolen. And those cases, there have been dozens of cases litigated in our courts that have gone to nowhere because there's really no credible evidence that that election was stolen. Remember that Donald Trump had asked Mike Pence to not certify the election results, and Mike Pence, in my opinion, rightly refused to do that. And, Donald Trump, certainly while he appeals to some, is a very divisive and controversial figure. So to me, it's really not surprising that many high-level officials from his prior administration decided to oppose him. On the debt mitigation and restructuring. So I have to very respectfully disagree with the premise of the question. The question says that President Trump has admirable debt mitigation and restructuring skills. I would respectfully disagree with that, because Donald Trump as businessman had actually failed multiple businesses, including Trump University, including casinos and many others. We know that President Trump, while he was in office, had implemented tax cuts really at the top for those who are really like in the top 1%. Our Congressional Budget Office has predicted, which is a bipartisan agency, has predicted that this will lead to actually the increase in the deficit. And so I really am not so sure that he actually has admirable debt mitigation and restructuring skills. And then on Elon Musk, that's really an interesting question. I would not be surprised if Elon Musk was offered a high-level post in this administration. We can sort of think about what that could be, but I would really not be surprised if he joined the Trump administration, because he seems to be, very allied with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is sort of loyal to his followers and tends to reward his followers. So I would predict that Elon Musk will definitely play some role. As to what exactly he would do or say, I don't really know, but I definitely see him as playing a role.
Okay, thank you. John.
So the name on most people's minds when they hear about prominent Republicans switching to Kamala Harris to Joe Biden is Liz Cheney and her father, Dick Cheney, the former vice president under George W. Bush. And I think the reason why you see Liz and Dick Cheney going to Biden Harris and Bobby Kennedy going to Donald Trump, literally Democrat royalty from the Kennedy family, is because there's a fundamental realignment in the country. If JFK were alive today, he'd have been campaigning with Donald Trump. And we know what Dick Cheney and the military industrial complex supports because he's still alive and he supported Biden and Harris ultimately. I don't think that the views or the positions of establishment Republicans or the Kennedy family really changed. I think that the parties took different positions. It's often said that Donald Trump has taken the Republican Party in a populist direction, very pro-union, very pro-worker, very pro-middle class. At the same time, you see most of the billionaire class, Elon Musk is kind of the exception, move over along with Wall Street to the Democratic Party. So in many respects, today's Republican Party is the Democrat Party of the 1960s and vice versa. Wall Street and the Cheneys have not changed their views. It's just that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden reflect their views more closely than Donald Trump does. So I think the word realignment is really the best understanding of why former Democrat Donald Trump, who used to be the darling of the Democrat Party, is now the head of the Republican Party along with his family. I think it's fundamentally because Donald Trump is still the same Democrat that he was from decades ago. It's just that the parties have really switched places in many respects. And that's not something Republicans or Democrats like to say out loud, but I think it's been a fundamental realignment. As to Elon Musk, I agree with Professor Stereo. I think he will have a significant role in the Trump administration. One thing that both Musk and Trump have talked about publicly is that he might be in charge of a new government agency department for efficiency, where his primary responsibility will be cutting the size of government and reducing bureaucracy. So I think it's very likely that Elon Musk will have a new position that will give him direct access to President Trump in terms of deciding what entire departments, sub-departments, agencies might be eliminated. So I think there is definitely concern in the DC bureaucracy because Elon Musk has no problem firing people, as the folks at Twitter learned.
I agree on that one. Okay, thank you very much, John. Yeah, please.
Your question, Goras, is very pertinent because in all modern constitutional democracy, one of the most challenging question is how to ensure that state and business interests do not go in the same direction, so that corporations do not capture state institutions. And we have these challenges here in Slovenia, where, as we know, both Prime Minister and President of the Republic are quite affluent former businessmen, or they are married with a very successful businessman. And it's always challenging, when you have a businessman coming into state institutions. There's a lot of risk for the rule of law, for state institutions, their strength, and also access to justice. So the role of Elon Musk is it's a controversial role because, of course, Milena and John, if you agree that he will have a role within the future Trump administration, then my question will be, for sure, he will have to disinvest from all of his companies, from Tesla, SpaceX, and so on. And the question is whether Elon Musk wants to do that. And obviously, my answer to that would be no. No, he wants to be invested. He wants to still run those companies, and he wants to be in the government to influence regulation, or to basically take away regulation in certain areas. And that will cause a lot of conflict of interest. Even during the election campaign, there was a lot of actual and potential conflict of interest. And John, you're right. It's also challenging. It's challenging to exclude business interests from state institutions. As you said, most of successful companies in US supported the Democratic candidate. And it's quite interesting today, if you look at Wall Street Stock Exchange, we just opened, you see Tesla stock is rising. It's more than 10% plus on the day. And then some of the Californian IT companies are down. Whose CEO supported Harris as a candidate. My take would be that this administration has to give a clear message on how to manage this conflict of interest. It's not acceptable that Elon Musk, if it accepts this role in this public agency, that he still is invested in the companies he runs at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Matej.
Thanks. A couple of points, and also I'd like to answer the sixth question that was just put in our chat. So with regard to the debt, I think the debt is not a problem for the U.S. as long as the dollar remains the world currency. In that sense, the sky is the limit. Because all the states in the world are eagerly taking dollars up, and so the U.S. consistently has an AAA ranking. So this, at least in the medium term, this is not and won't be a problem. I agree with John, and I'd like to dwell a little bit on that point, that this election in particular, with the benefit of hindsight, what happened over the last 10, 15 years, actually do demonstrate seismic shifts in our societies, in American society, in European society. And with regard to and one of those seismic shifts is also this relationship between the social media and the mainstream media. And I participated yesterday at the AmCham meeting here in Ljubljana in the evening, and one of the speakers said that this particular election will be a test for which media are more influential, which media have more impact on the electoral outcome. And it's clear that judging by in which direction the mainstream media have gone, that the social media have more impact. And that's not necessarily good, and it's something that should be reflected upon, because if the mainstream media or the media, that their role has historically been to keep up the public sphere. And once we all just remove ourselves in our own echo chambers in the social media, the public sphere is gone, and we start basically living in separate and parallel worlds, and just being, in our own camps of friends and enemies. And in that way, no country can succeed in a longer run. So, to end on a positive note from my side, I do not know how this administration will actually perform. We will see all sorts of things will also pop up on the global level that we cannot predict at this moment. The administration will need to deliver. Donald Trump has promised a lot. Basically, he will achieve everything in his words, and we know that the reality is different, right? The utility will at a certain point run out, and there will be a new administration elected at a certain point after 4 years. But I hope that after 4 years, there will be indeed a market for a different kind of politics. The one that will go back to civility, tolerance, and fairness. The one that will again start bridging the different people, the different points of view, the different worldviews in our society, that will pride itself with cooperation among the people, and not just exacerbating and encouraging and flaring up this toxic environment, toxic political environment in which we've found ourselves on both sides of the Atlantic over the last decade and a half. And I think this is important for the global survival of the democracy, because no matter what we say and what kind of opinion we have of the US and Europe, together with Australia, Japan, and some other states of the world, these are the only pristine and genuine democracies left. All the rest is basically, to that or another extent, are authoritarian regimes. And these authoritarian regimes are waging proxy wars to make the West more feeble. And I think we should be mindful of that.
Okay, thank you very much, also Matej. So we have like 2 minutes, and if anyone out of the speakers wishes to add, that's like the last sentence, I can give you the word. Otherwise, I would more or less kindly like to end this debate, because I know that two of the speakers have to leave in 3 minutes, 2 minutes to other debates and lectures and so on. So I would maybe just conclude the whole debate and say thank you to all of you, especially the two guests coming from or joining in from the US, especially in the morning there in your time. And once more, thank you very much. And really, I hope that we will meet or organize some other, and not only in 4 years' time, but that we meet and organize something else in maybe a bit sooner, and not at the next elections that will come around in 4 years. So thank you very much to all of you, also to all the attendees that have participated in the debate, and especially once more to all of my panelists that have joined me today. Thank you very much, and have a great day.